co-leads the West Farmer Centre for Infectious Diseases Research. But Chris, one of the reasons I've invited him today, also co-chairs our Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, which is the main body that advises our government on immunisation policies for the country. And of course, in that capacity, Chris has had a big role in advising on the introduction of the COVID-19 vaccines in Australia. He's also a clinician, so he will bring together a wealth of knowledge across the clinical aspects of COVID-19 vaccines, but also around the policy decisions in Australia and how they might be relevant to the Pacific. So I'll pass it on to you, Chris, and thank you for making the time to talk to us.
Pleasure, Mary. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. We can't see any slides. Not sure if you see.
That's right. I do have some slides. I suppose I just wanted to introduce myself. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to well, this audience that's spread over so many kilometres. It's fantastic to have an opportunity to talk to you. I thought what I'd do is I'd show probably about 10 to 12 minutes of slides, just giving some background to some of the decision making in the Australian context, and clearly that's very different than other contexts, but I thought it was a good launch pad to then go into some of the questions. And my understanding, speaking to Meru last week, is I think some of the questions are probably where the greatest knowledge can be discussed and shared in this environment. So let me just put some slides up. If people want to interrupt me for specific questions, feel free, but also very happy to answer the questions in the chat or others afterward. I'll just share my screen. So I'm going to touch on COVID vaccines. One, I wanted to really highlight the why, and I think actually, I don't need to explain to this audience the why, but I do frequently when I give talks reflect on where we're up to globally at this stage. Clearly under ascertainment, but an emerging global crisis, the greatest of which we've seen for 100 years. I also highlight, and I'm no economist, but clearly countries such as many of yours that have controlled COVID today have clearly done much better from an economic perspective than those who've had unchecked activity, where really that has had significant economic consequences. But I think probably the why that really is driving many of us at the moment is the crisis that's folding in India at this stage, really highlighting a country who we believed had things actually pretty well in check a couple of months ago is clearly out of control again. So the uncertainty as we look to the future for all of our countries needs to be held close, and importantly, we do need to plan for potential disaster. And so COVID vaccines are clearly part of that solution. The what, realistically, I know that a number of your countries have access to different types of vaccines, and I'm not going to try and cover all of those. Clearly, non-replicating adenoviral vector vaccines such as AstraZeneca is clearly an important component of that. Some of you have access to mRNA vaccines and other vaccines as well. And importantly, our vaccine armamentarium is going to continue to grow in this space. So I believe that we are going to continue to have increasing different vaccines available, and we'll need to learn more about how to use those together. In the Australian program, we are currently using 2 vaccines. I highlight that with the knowledge that it's likely to grow with others coming online, but at the moment we're using both Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines. They were approved by our regulator in January and February respectively, and the programs with those vaccines commenced in February and March respectively, and they both have important roles in our program, and I'll talk about that shortly. A bit of a slide about what we know, because it is really challenging to try and decipher the information that's coming out so quickly. Also, that clearly the media is involved in interpreting some of this. So in my take, both Pfizer and AstraZeneca are effective vaccines, and we have good data now. They're effective in both older people and younger people. This was an uncertainty early on, but actually I think there's overwhelming data to demonstrate this, both from clinical trials, but importantly, real-world effectiveness studies. I think we have great clarity now that actually the efficacy is highest against more severe disease. So these are vaccines that are largely designed to keep people out of hospital, and that needs to be our focus. But it is likely that they will reduce transmission, but by how much is uncertain at this stage. There is emerging data about reduction in transmission, which is a great thing, but they have not been designed as transmission-busting vaccines. And efficacy has been demonstrated after one dose for both of these vaccines and many of the vaccines we're using. But at this stage, I think we're all convinced that actually second doses and potentially boosters may be required going forward. There is emerging data about efficacy against emerging strains. I don't think any vaccine is immune to strain emergence. It's just by how much it varies compared to their published estimate that varies between different vaccines. I think this is a real challenging point because none of us know where the emerging strains are heading. And importantly, there is always going to be a lead time for vaccine reconfiguration. I know both AstraZeneca and Pfizer, but many other countries are looking to variant vaccines. The challenge is how do you go that from recognition through to getting it into arms? What we don't know yet is how well these vaccines work in specific subpopulations. And although I highlight people with immune problems or immunocompromising conditions, that is one of an example of where we don't have great clarity, but we don't expect that they are. We expect they will have efficacy, we just don't know how much. We don't know how long they're going to last, and importantly, how long immunity lasts. Clearly, we have data out to about 6 months at this stage, but is this years of protection? Don't know. Efficacy against emerging strains and whether boosters required. I've covered off on that already. There was a lot of concern back in January, published concern internationally about the effectiveness of AstraZeneca vaccines. I've often sort of highlighted we've actually had an apples and oranges conversation. Clinical trials are vastly different, and trying to compare the point estimates from clinical trials published between different vaccines is an exercise in futility. I think what we do have now is real world effectiveness data that show that all the vaccines used at the moment are effective and importantly are likely to play very important roles. So I don't think vaccine decisions at a national level should be made on efficacy estimates from clinical trials. Although this will be old knowledge to this group, I really highlight that everyone has been talking about efficacy, but actually, you know what? We need to talk about vaccine impact. We need a vaccine that works. We need to know that it works in the real world. And importantly, we need to get it into arms. And the steps between having a vaccine and getting into arms are one of the really important challenges. And vaccine coverage, which is really linked to confidence, trust, and access, are as important as what the published efficacy estimate is. Many of you would have seen that in Australia, we've pivoted up our program to preferentially recommend Pfizer under the age of 50, given the rare, and I do say rare, looking at about 1 in 125,000 doses at the moment are linked to severe clots from the AstraZeneca vaccine. Our Australian data and the emerging international data suggests young people are more predisposed to this compared to older people, and we had the luxury of having 2 vaccines accessible. I believe we need to put this into perspective, and clearly if you look at the impact of even moderate COVID activity, it far outweighs the risk of this complication. So although we have made a policy shift in the Australian setting, that is in a setting of limited disease. That policy change would need to change again if we saw significant activity, and all of us believe, particularly at an Australian national level, that having a vaccinated population still remains our utmost priority because the risk of incursion, given the tenuous control that all countries in our region have on this disease. I'm happy to answer questions about this because this is a tricky area that we are learning more about, and importantly, will continue to unfold. The WHO, well, this is our Prime Minister, but clearly our government has made a commitment to vaccinate all Australians. Now, clearly that's not possible at this stage because we, one, don't have licensed vaccines for children, but I do believe that we do need to focus on that. Importantly, our goal in the Australian program is protection. It's keeping people out of hospital, and I think we need to keep that front and centre when we're talking about this. If we can ensure economic stability, if we can open borders up and all those important things, that's great, but actually still just providing individuals and community with protection from the harms of COVID remains our priority. And the Australian Technical Group on Immunisation, the group that I chair, have really stated this from the beginning. And so that is why in Australia we're rolling out in what we have talked about priority populations, and we have used the terms phases 1A, 1B, 2A and 2B. In simple terms, what we're trying to do is we're trying to protect our borders up front by immunising those involved in our quarantine system and healthcare. We're then moving on to those with risk, including the elderly, those with underlying medical conditions, and importantly, those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who expect to be at higher risk. And then following that, we're really moving on to the next phases, which is getting the rest of the adult population vaccinated. Unfortunately, when you put slides out like this, politicians like to talk about timelines. I think timelines are really challenging given what we're facing at the moment. One, communication and supply being an ongoing challenge. But this is our rollout strategy. And although there's been some tweaks to this, this is the overall structure and remains true to this day. This is how we're doing it in the Australian situation. Don't worry about the detail. In other words, what we're using is multiple different strategies, from hubs to local providers, governments going into aged care facilities, and this is very context specific. Every country needs to design its rollout strategy based on access and what sort of healthcare practitioners you have access to deliver its vaccines. Let me talk about communication and confidence, because I think this is something that we all struggle with and something that we need to do well. I think people are looking to health leaders such as yourselves. And so, photo of me getting my vaccine, but importantly, we do need to discuss our vaccine opportunities and highlight the benefits. But some hints too. This is a slide I've taken from some of the work that Australian researchers in the vaccine confidence space have really been talking about. This is some points from Margie Danchin. What works? We need to, when we're talking about vaccines in our countries, we need to communicate frequently, and we need to talk about what we're trying to achieve. We need to give clear, accurate and actionable messages. In other words, we need to design them around the health literacy of the population we're giving them to. When we announce something, we need to tell them why and how they should respond. We do need to promote vaccine, but I don't think blanket statements such as all or none help us in this stage, because we will see events occurring and we'll need to explain those in public spaces. So promote, but don't reassure. Use multiple complementary channels, and that will be context specific, whether that be local radio, whether that be community spokespeople. There's lots of different ways to do it, but importantly, making sure those messages that those spokespeople are giving are similar. Misinformation is abound, and that may be on social media, that may be in community. We need to identify those, call them out, and try to address them as much as we can with clear and consistent communication. We need to prioritise some of the key groups for communication. Who are we trying to target? Is it healthcare workers who can disseminate that message? Is it community people? Is it also critics? We need to use credible spokespeople, and importantly, and I think Mero would agree, we need to have our medical and health leaders out there talking about this as much as our politicians. Importantly, community people look to health leaders, and having worked in the Pacific myself, it's clear that the health leadership has a very important role here. We need to use data and ensure transparency. Never before have we had community people so engaged with information flows. And so if we don't put data out there, explain it, understand what it means, and make sure that what we're doing is transparent, people will lead to misinformation. And a part of any strategy, we've got to work out whether it works. We need to look at community sentiment, we need to receive feedback, and we need to tweak that. So back to the Australian program, when? So realistically, I'm not sure it helps us giving timelines of when we're going to achieve a community vaccination target. We have committed in Australia to try and get as many people vaccinated in 2021 as possible, and I think that should remain our goals. So just at the end of my brief slides, the why, the what, the how, the who, and the when. It's an exciting time to be a vaccinologist. Never have we had the need, but also some of the technologies to change the course of a disease. And that's where we are at this stage. Enormous challenges, but exciting times. Vaccine is clearly a part of the solution. I'm not sure anyone in the vaccine space believes it is the only solution. Long-lasting, durable protection from a single vaccine is unlikely, I think, to stop this pandemic. But importantly, what we can do now to protect people who are most vulnerable and communities most vulnerable has enormous benefits, and that needs to be our focus. And we need to, as health leaders, make sure that we clearly communicate, that we engage with the community, because that will be as important to protection as vaccine efficacy. Reflecting on my comments about vaccine impact, there is no point having a vaccine that's sitting in the fridge. So how we communicate this and how we promote vaccination during this pandemic is as relevant as what vaccine we choose. And with that, I'll stop, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chris. That was really fantastic. And we have a lot of questions coming through, which is really great. And so one of the first, I guess the first question is around, and a lot of people have asked about the efficacy or effectiveness of the AstraZeneca vaccine, particularly around against the variants. There were specific questions about the variants circulating in India at the moment, but in general, I think there's a few questions and concerns about the efficacy or effectiveness against the variant strains. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
So I think there's a couple of pieces in there. As I said, all vaccines are susceptible to the variants. Susceptible to loss of efficacy with variants. So we're not going to get away with this vaccine depending on which vaccine we choose. Clearly, the South African variant is probably less responsive to the AstraZeneca vaccine. I think the South African data showed us. That being said, incredibly small numbers included in that trial. So I do think if you have the capacity to know what is circulating in the country or in your region, that is important to know, but I'm not sure you can make national vaccine decisions based on this.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And there's a particular question, and Chris, maybe you might want to answer it and I can pitch in, is around the AstraZeneca vaccines that are made in India, and India is obviously vaccinated a significant proportion, significant number, not proportion. So if yes, do we know if this vaccine works against the Indian variants? If not, why? Like, is it not effective against the COVID strains in India? Is that why they're seeing this big surge in numbers?
Mary, that's a great question. I'd like to know the answer. I don't at this stage. I don't think we have seen that. I'm interested whether anyone else has seen any data to inform this at this stage. I have not. And I think we need to understand what's happening in India from a vaccine effectiveness perspective to understand what's happening. But actually, I think it's probably going to be a small part of what is an unfolding crisis at the moment, which is unchecked community transmission.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris, and that's my understanding. We actually don't have a very good understanding of the different strains that are circulating in India because they do only a small proportion. Of course, India is a big country, so we only have 1 to 2% of isolates that are sequenced. Of course, in the current climate, when a lot of people, there's widespread community transmission, not all isolates or not all people are tested. And then of those, only a small proportion are sequenced. We do know that the B1.617 that somebody has put in the chat is circulating, but I myself also haven't seen any data, but keen to hear from the audience if they have seen any data. But also, even though India's vaccinated a large number of people, it's only a small proportion of their population. So 110 or 120 million, it's still one dose vaccinated is a small proportion of India's overall population. And that's across 2 vaccines, the Covaxin, which is, I think, an inactivated cell-based vaccine, and the AstraZeneca. So yeah, definitely need to learn. But I think it comes back to the point that vaccination is going to be one part of the public health response for this disease for a long time to come, and we're going to need strong public health measures against it. Chris, the other one was around vaccinating people who have been infected previously, whether they should get the 1 dose or 2 doses. Is there any point of getting the vaccine if you've had previous infection, either with the wild type or the variant strain?
Yeah, good question. We've had to face this in the Australian setting because we've got increasing numbers of people coming back from overseas, a number who have clearly demonstrated laboratory evidence. We don't know how long immunity to vaccine is going to last at this stage. So our current recommendation in Australia is they should be vaccinated, but a window of approximately 6 months is a reasonable period of time. I think as information about the durability of immunity emerges, we'll be able to get more nuanced advice. I think it's important to address a safety issue there. In the clinical trials of those who either had vaccine and then got infected, or importantly, got infected and then had vaccine, the reactogenicity, the severity of side effects was not different. So we're not seeing potentiation of disease by vaccination. So I don't think we should be worried about boosting people who've had natural infection before. Whether it's necessary, we don't know at this stage. So I would not be excluding people from a public health program if they have suspicion or confirmed laboratory disease. I still think there's benefit.
Thank you, Chris. Chris, any thoughts? Is there a difference between the Serum Institute of India manufacturing the AZ vaccine compared to the other manufacturers of the AstraZeneca vaccine?
We have not seen any comparative effectiveness data comparing different manufacturing techniques of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And importantly, I think they're going to be really hard to compare because the context of where they're being rolled out is so vastly different. And as to my slide earlier, context is so specific for effectiveness. Now, my understanding of some of the comparative data, the immunogenicity is very similar and things like that. So I don't expect vast differences, but can I be confident that the effectiveness is exactly the same? Of course, can't at this stage.
Chris, Chris, vaccine hesitancy amongst healthcare workers. Are we seeing much of that in Australia, concerns in healthcare workers, and how are we tackling with this in Australia?
In general, in Australia, healthcare workers have actually been very pro-vaccine in this space. We always have vaccine hesitancy in every country, and that occurs in healthcare workers and non-healthcare workers. I think the way you combat that is exactly the same as you do as a community. You need a clear communication strategy. People need to understand the risks and the benefits. They need to understand the important role that healthcare workers have, not only in their risk of exposure, but also the risk of transmission to other patients, and really we need to have those conversations. If you are seeing hesitancy in healthcare workers, I'd really encourage people to directly engage with what we've got at this stage. Hesitancy varies in different populations, but I also focus in the Australian context, most people are actually either pro-vaccine or maybe sitting on the fence. There's a very small group who are truly hesitant. We should be focusing on those who are sitting on the fence at the moment, waiting for more information. We provide that information to them and expect they'll make the right decision for them. Spending a huge amount of effort on the small proportion who are truly hesitant or anti-vaccine is probably not a wise investment in time and effort.
Thank you, Chris. And just for everyone's reference, in 2 weeks' time, as part of this, we're also having Professor Julie Lisk, who is a science risk communication, community engagement expert, and does a lot of work on vaccine communication. So it'll be really fantastic to hear from her I think it's in 2 weeks' time from now, but we'll send a reminder to everyone. So she'll have some good insights and tools as well.
I'd encourage everyone to join that. Julie is one of my go-to people in this space. I use her frequently to help craft some of my messages, and so she is a wonderful resource for you. So I'm excited that you get an opportunity to hear her speak.
And I do want to say thank you for sending all your questions, but also if people want to turn on their camera and actually ask their questions, please feel free to monitor hands or just jump in and ask questions by turning on your camera and audio on as well. Chris, there were some questions around, I guess, vaccinating subpopulations last week as well. And there are questions around vaccinating pregnant women, patients with cancer, advanced liver disease. So any contraindications for vaccination? It'll be great to get your thoughts on that.
The only true contraindications for vaccines is anaphylaxis to that previous vaccine. So in many ways, we have no true contraindications apart from a very small population. In the Australian context, we are not promoting vaccination of pregnant women given the epidemiological context that we're sitting in at the moment. But if you look at what's happening in the UK and in North America, large volumes of these vaccines are going into pregnant women with no important safety signal. I have no significant concerns about the safety of these vaccines from what we've seen in pregnant women, but clearly they haven't been included in the clinical trials. So if your context in your country is similar to that in mine, I think we can hold off vaccinating pregnant women at the moment. But if that changes, they are an important group. The other important groups are those with underlying medical conditions, and clearly some of those conditions, particularly the immunosuppressive conditions, are at vastly greater risk of severe disease, and importantly, your elderly populations as well. Age still remains the most important risk factor for severe disease, and so your strategy about trying to protect your elderly is important as well.
Chris, it's Chris Hare speaking. Thanks for the talk. There's a couple of people that might like to ask their questions in person, and it's nice to engage. I might ask Dr. Mei Ling, because May's, you're online, Mei Ling? You had a couple of questions.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Oh, thank you very much for that presentation. Very informative. Yeah, some of my questions are already presented by presented earlier. One I think I just posted. What was that? Oh, right. It's on dual vaccination. I mean, I guess Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are, you know, the technology used to manufacture is different from AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. So just wondering about dual vaccination. What's the data out there? Like if you're reacting to one vaccine, you might want to take the other vaccine. Is that in terms of effectiveness?
Although these vaccines are clearly trying to promote a similar immunological response, they are vastly different vaccines. They are both quite reactogenic vaccines if we compare Pfizer and AstraZeneca. And actually, if you look at it, it's also related to the order what we're seeing in the Australian safety data, and it's actually being shown out internationally, is often your second dose of Pfizer vaccine is much more reactogenic as far as sore arms, but also some of the systemic side effects. And from an AstraZeneca vaccine, often the first dose is quite reactogenic. So these are more reactogenic vaccines than some of the other vaccines we use in our programs as well. I think that's important for people to know. We're not seeing cross-reactivity though. So if you're reacted to a Pfizer vaccine, you're not necessarily going to react to an AstraZeneca vaccine or the other way around. So if you have had someone who has, for example, anaphylaxis to a Pfizer vaccine, we are promoting they receive an AstraZeneca vaccine and giving that safely at this stage. And the same goes around.
Question from Dr. Malani. Are you there, Dr. Malani? Did you want to ask your question about the clotting syndrome in young people?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Chris. It's a fantastic presentation. We really enjoyed that. I think I did send one question earlier on just about why the younger people are more likely to get them. And I think just for me at the moment, just looking at this new, we're getting the B16, 17, that's what my questions earlier on. And my issue is that, is there, and maybe we haven't had that enough to know, a criteria for looking at, okay, you looking at all the, and say your risk is such and such. Already one of the doctors already told me, one of the lady doctors told me, oh, I'm not having it because I've calculated my risk and my risk is actually high of getting AstraZeneca. So that's one question. The other one is, is there such thing? The other one is there's some genetic or racial distributions. If you are in a European country, you're probably likely to get that. Again, we might still not have covered that enough. So my mind is just going through this variant, and I'm a little bit concerning here for Fiji. And I just want to see. I think one of the presenters last presentation, Dr. Shield, I think in one of your coverage of your slide, you mentioned one of the variant was 10% coverage by the vaccine. So that was part of my asking that questions again.
Yeah, that was the South African variant, the B1351, where I think it's the data from South Africa, there was about 10% effectiveness against the mild to moderate disease, and that Chris was talking about as well. Whereas again, 117, I think we've seen it, which was the UK variant, we've seen better effectiveness from the AstraZeneca. Professor Malani, I'll let Chris answer the question, but are you seeing a lot of healthcare worker hesitancy in Fiji? Are people concerned about getting the vaccine in Fiji or in other countries? Keen to hear from people.
Again, I can't give you an exact number at the moment. I know earlier on some of the vaccination rates were about 38-40% in some countries. I think earlier on in Fiji, there were a lot of concerns about getting the virus because of all the informations on the net, and then people are spreading all the false fears. But my feel is that it's been really quite good. In fact, we've run out of vaccine in the first few stages now. I have a feel that the approach, I think that the general awareness of the people are actually quite good, and people are coming across to get the vaccine. And the others can correct me if I'm correct, but my feel is that it's actually been, I think the whole population is actually coming across. Yes.
Mary, do you want me to answer some of those questions about the thrombosis issue?
Yes,
I think what we're seeing is age is clearly a risk factor, and I'll talk about that in a sec. Although a lot of the initial reports were coming out about women being at greater risk, I think that's clearly emerging that probably sex is not a significant risk. In fact, it was much more related to which populations were receiving the vaccine. So these episodes are occurring in men and women. I have not seen any racial or genetic data that would think that one group is more predisposed to the other. That being said, the numbers of cases nationally and internationally are still relatively small, and we're learning lots about this. You're right, and I'm just reflecting on your comment about your younger healthcare worker comment. The risk for a young healthcare worker of severe outcome from COVID, particularly when there's not much COVID, is small. And so that's why in the Australian context, we've made some of the decisions we've made. But also we need to put that into context. There is an ever-present and ongoing risk of community activity. And with that, the risk even to the young dramatically increases. I can share the links with some of the information we've done in the Australian context that tries to balance up risk of thrombosis and risk of severe COVID as far as hospitalisation, ICU admission and things like that. Now, that looks very skewed when you have no disease, but also it looks very skewed when you have a lot of disease. And we're trying to generate this to help people put this into context. What is my real risk of being hospitalised, going to intensive care and potentially dying of COVID if and when it hits, versus my risk of clotting at this stage. And importantly, those numbers are incredibly small, but we're hoping that that can then inform discussions between clinicians and the people they're trying to encourage to be vaccinated.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much.
Invite Dr. Ravi, I believe he's online, and to share a bit of experience from Fiji in the current climate, but also because of his role in the vaccine delivery side of things. Ravi, are you online?
Yeah, thank you, Meru. Thank you very much, Christopher, for the nice talk. It was quite informative. I think our vaccine rollout has been in batches, the batches that we received. And initially in the first batch, our vaccine coverage for CWM was only 20%. This is frontline workers. And because initially a lot of frontline workers did not participate, it was rolled out to the general public. The public took it up very eagerly. So that's why our supply finished. But in the second round, we are seeing a more better uptake. So at the moment, we've almost reached 50% for CWM, but this is a bit slow still, we think. So there is a group like some sitting on the fence, and some are very hard to convince, but we just have to tease out which groups are which and how we will disseminate the information. But I think vaccine hesitancy is a big problem, and it's mostly due to the experience I see is mostly due to the clotting risk, and it's just identifying how much risk each person has. And the prevention of COVID changed drastically, so a lot of people are now more willing to take up vaccination. That's it from my end.
Thank you, Ravi. That's really useful and helpful to know. Dr. William, would you like to ask your question? I can see you've put a couple of questions around mixing of different vaccines.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just putting forward the question, particularly from resource limited countries, where, you know, if it comes to a certain point and we have not much choice, what would be your advice if, you know, the first batch is Astra and we've got Pfizer only as a second choice? Can we do that? What are the data looking like so far, if there's any such practice that have been carried out? And also among AstraZeneca users, whether there's a difference from the, is it the Covishield from India and the one from Korea? Does it matter under the same AstraZeneca? Or is there no difference? We don't know the answer because we've got the first batch from Korea, I guess, and the second one from India. Can we mix the two? We have those one from Korea and those two from Covishield. Yeah.
I think they're really good questions. There's a couple of things in there. One, if doses are limited, one dose effectiveness is not perfect, but actually pretty good for all of these vaccines. So you may, at a programmatic level, decide to focus on trying to get as many one doses in before the second dose. Now, clearly that's dependent on access to vaccines and what you, how you are rolling out your program. Our understanding of mixed schedules will emerge, and I actually think they will work, but can I put any data on the table at this stage? We can't. The Oxford group is driving a number of studies looking at Pfizer followed by Astra, Astra followed by Pfizer. I expect they will work, and I expect that mixed schedules will be an important thing going forward. The third piece to that question is, what about some of the variation between different manufacturing plants of the same vaccine? In the Australian context, if you've received a Indian AstraZeneca vaccine and you're coming for a booster, we are giving you a Australian-made AstraZeneca vaccine. We expect that works. We are not recommending mixing schedules at this stage in the Australian context, unless there's a concern about allergy or side effects, until we have more data. When that data is available, importantly, I expect we'll get to that point. It is likely, and I think from an immunology perspective, it makes sense that if we do go down a booster pathway, we'll end up boosting people with a different type of vaccine compared to their initial primary schedule. So, you know, something such as a Pfizer followed by a Novavax booster looks quite attractive to me on first principles, but we don't have any data for that. So I suppose in summary, think about your program, and importantly, if you have limited doses, how best to roll those doses out to spread the coverage as much as possible, such as the UK did with their AstraZeneca rollout. 2, use mixed schedules if you had to, and keep a watch on the emerging data.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. William and Chris. Dr. Lagakali, did you want to ask your question around boosters for the vaccine?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Just have a question. So if you get your 2 jabs from the AstraZeneca vaccine, are you covered for life? Or do you need a yearly booster like a flu vaccine?
I'd love to answer that question now. We don't know. Realistically, we don't know at this stage. We expect there's 2 things in there. It's one, how the immunity to original vaccine wanes over time, and immunity against vaccines and wane, and importantly, what strains emerge. And so I believe that you will need boosters in the future, but what and when, we don't know at this stage. Realistically, I would be providing the public and healthcare workers messages about the importance of protection now to cover them for this period, but uncertainty when this will need to be repeated. I expect that actually immunity will be durable for some time, but I don't think we have vaccines that are going to be a pandemic busting, long lasting vaccine for life.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, I had a question. What about vaccinating around other adult vaccines like flu vaccine or pneumococcal vaccine, if in certain contexts it's becoming relevant? Is there a recommendation or any data on how much gap should be provided around that, or can you get them at the same time? What do we know about that?
Yeah, great question. So if we reflect on what data the companies have at this stage, they are recommending either a 7 or a 14-day gap. Now, that's saying they don't have data on shortening that gaps, and those studies are being done at the moment. So in the Australian context, we've done a blanket policy statement that you should separate your COVID vaccine away from another vaccine by 14 days, unless there's a reason that you may miss out on both. So we do not think there's going to be an efficacy issue there. Now, giving a whole stack of vaccines at this day might increase reactogenicity, and so people should be aware of that. I think that window will come down over time, and I think we will have co-administration going forward, but we are not doing that in the Australian program yet as we roll out on this initial phase.
Thank you, Chris. I think we've gone through a lot of questions, but Dr. Maria, you had one question around boosters. Would you like to ask that question? Dr. Maria, are you still online? I can read it out.
Sorry, asking me? Did you?
No, it was Dr. Maria, but Professor Malani, if you have another question, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Let me just get myself out of here.
Dr. Maria here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Maria. I can hear you.
I'm a GP in Fiji.
There you go.
Yeah. I think the GP, the vaccine AstraZeneca to GPs were our first jabs was fantastic. We were all very enthusiastic in receiving it. My question is about the booster of AstraZeneca, and when do you think will we get the booster after the first jab? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Maria. And I've got to admit, I don't know enough about the Fiji program at the moment, but I can tell you what the data shows as far as the gap. The studies show that actually a longer gap probably increases vaccine effectiveness. So in Australia, we have elected to go for a longer gap of 3 months between doses, as opposed to the 4 weeks, which is possible. So we're recommending boosters at 3 months. That being said, if that's 8 weeks, if that's 16 weeks, I'm not overly fussed by that. But I do think there's some benefit from a program perspective to try and increase that distance between first and second dose for 2 reasons. One, it allows you to use first doses more widely when you don't have a lot of doses, and importantly, probably improves vaccine effectiveness. Many of the differences between the vaccine effectiveness estimates from the AstraZeneca trial probably were related to variations in the dose interval. So in general, I think a longer dose interval makes the data suggests that actually is more effective in that way. So I'd be lining up at 3 months, but it also is informed by your program.
And I think Ravi's just confirmed that it is a 12 weeks gap recommended in Fiji. So that's great.
That's fantastic. I think that's a great policy decision.
Yeah. Right. Professor Malani, back to you for your question, and then to Eileen after that around the measles and COVID question. Professor Malani.
Sorry, Professor, I was going to ask a bit more question here. If you had the choice of all these shots that are going around, would you have a particular preference, and why?
I don't have a preference at this stage. I actually think many of the shots going around has benefits and disadvantages. And I've strongly argued that actually access to I'm not talking about a suite, but actually a number of different vaccines would be useful, because one, even the Australian context, trying to distribute Pfizer vaccines with some of the logistical challenges are significant. We know that particularly with the TSS issue, if you only had AstraZeneca, that has some issues as well. So I think actually access to a number of vaccines really gives countries flexibility with their program at this stage. That being said, unfortunately, that luxury is not necessarily afforded to all countries at this stage. So importantly, using what tools you've got as wisely as you can.
And I guess, yeah, and that's a huge point and an area that I'm passionate about. And Professor, you spoke about it as part of our COVAX discussion last week as well. And I think we need to be hopeful and optimistic that more vaccines variety will become available. I do know that there are 7 under discussions for COVAX itself. Of course, there'll be new vaccines that will get the emergency use authorization from WHO, but some might also become available through COVAX facility. And once we have that, I think that will again give countries a little bit more flexibility to design programs that are best suited to their context and region as well, and based on the disease epidemiology, their age structure, etc., all the considerations. Mylene, at you for your question around measles and immune amnesia. Would you like to ask that?
Yeah, thank you, Amiru. We all know what happened, was it last year or the year before? Measles in Fiji and Samoa. And there is a definite, I think probably one of the horrifying effects of measles is immune amnesia. And I'm just wondering, you know, people who have had measles would have immune amnesia against other susceptible diseases. And when it comes to COVID and vaccination, and the age criteria for vaccination, should we be considering vaccinating those less than 18? We only have AstraZeneca, but would it be safe?
I think there's a couple of things in there.
Or maybe, yeah.
So certainly immunosuppression, whether that be due to a condition, a drug, or even previous measles exposure, may impact on immunity. But the emerging data suggests that these vaccines are still likely to offer protection. So one, importantly, regardless of their past history of immunosuppression, I do recommend this vaccine, importantly, because that sort of degree of immunosuppression is a risk factor for disease. We do not yet have the data, particularly for AstraZeneca, about vaccinating children. And so it is not registered for children at this stage. Many of those studies are ongoing, and there's plans, particularly with the AstraZeneca, to go into the adolescents. And I think that's an important group for us to consider, and then to progressively wind back to younger children. But from a programmatic perspective, I would not be advocating vaccinating children, even some of those higher risk children, immunosuppression, past measles and things like that at this stage. All the vaccines are basically looking towards the pediatric indication. But importantly, we need to understand what they look like, how well they work, and what sort of safety profile they look like before going down that path. And importantly, we all understand that that's going to be an important hurdle for true community protection.
Thank you, Chris.
Sorry, Dr. Merritt. I'm sorry for phasing out. I just got an urgent message because another positive contact, so I had to answer it, unfortunately. So my apologies, Professor, for just getting out from that. But thank you very much indeed. I've got to phase out, but thank you so much indeed. I've got another Zoom on the other side, so thank you so much indeed, and thank you, Dr. Shield, and thank you, Chris, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Malani. Please don't apologize. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Toto, I know you have a question and I will come back to you in a second, but I'm also mindful that Dr. Blyth has to head off to another meeting. So I do want to take the opportunity to thank you, Chris, for taking up the time and talking and presenting and talking to us. So thank you. We'll let you go.
Thanks, Mary. But importantly, if there are further questions that people think I can answer, Mary's got my contact details. I'm sure that Chris does too. I'm quite happy to answer those electronically as quickly as I can.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Toto, do you want to ask your question? And I can try and ask one for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Meru. Yeah, that was a very great presentation, and it's opened up a lot of, answered most of the questions that we had in mind, that I had in mind. Now, my question is just regarding the vaccination, because our travel advisory just changed yesterday, and it's including that you have to have your complete vaccination done before you can enter the country. My question is around quarantine, and I know that Chris has mentioned this, that vaccination is only part of the solution, and we still need to continue with the public health. And so my question is around quarantine. What is the practice now in Australia? If you get your full vaccination, does that warrant you to not go into quarantine? What is your advice on that, please?
Yeah,
thank you.
Dr. Toto, can I ask you where you're based? Sorry, I should know, but
yeah, sorry, I'm in Samoa. I'm based in the main hospital.
You're in Samoa. Great.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one, but what we do know at the moment, we actually don't have enough evidence to exempt people from quarantine if they've received the vaccine. Partly because of the reason that, as Chris presented, and we talked about it previously, we don't know if these vaccines will prevent onward transmission. So there might be, and no vaccine at the moment is 100% effective. What that means is that we know that these vaccines are really targeted at preventing hospitalization and people dying. And so some people who have the vaccine might be mildly sick. And that's our main goal at the moment, is to protect our health system, is really so people are not in the hospital. So, and then if somebody catches the virus before, they might have mild disease, but we don't know actually if they can pass it on to other people. So that's where the evidence is weak at the moment. And we will find out in the next few months, because as more and more of the world becomes vaccinated, I've seen some studies come overnight as well from the UK, looking at that there is a very strong reduction in transmission from the AstraZeneca vaccine. So more and more evidence will become available, but at the moment, we don't know that yet. So in the Australian context, people still have to quarantine even if they have received any of the vaccines overseas. And I think it's because we don't know enough of the evidence. Now, that said, that might change over the coming months, and the conditions of quarantine might change. So again, in talking in the Australian context and some of the other countries, I understand that people are managed in a hotel or a facility-based isolation and quarantine. That might be, if that somebody is vaccinated, they might be able to do home quarantine. And I know that that is under consideration, or at least verbal discussion in some parts. So I think as we learn more about the impact on transmission, we will be able to better assess whether those people are no risk. Because the reason quarantine is done is to minimize the introduction of the disease into the area. So once we know that they can't pass it on to others, then I think it will be okay. But at the moment, can we say with 100% confidence? Not really.
All right, that's great to know, Merils, because yeah, it's a bit, well, it is very concerning for us. As you may have seen on the news, that some people got released early from quarantine just because they had their full vaccination done. And I think that information should get to our public health people and administrators. But thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I think the evidence will become, I think it's very supportive, but whether we can say with 100% confidence is really difficult to know.
Sure, thank you.
I am mindful of the time, but anyone else have any last few questions? Or Chris, I might pass it back to you.
Oh, I don't really have any questions. I did have a clinical question, and in fact, the experts in the audience will be able to answer this for me or yourself, Meru. But what about the patient? I suppose as a clinician, I'm interested in the patients that are really immunosuppressed and very vulnerable, like those undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. And in my mind field, it's people receiving, really strong immunosuppression, high doses of prednisolone and stuff. Do you know if they can safely receive an AstraZeneca jab, particularly the chemotherapy patients?
Yeah, Chris, I can check, but and I'm keen to, there are far more experienced clinicians in the thing, but as Chris said, I think the only contraindication is if you've got anaphylaxis to the vaccine components, so just the ingredients of the vaccine. But to my knowledge, it's not an contraindication, but I do know that there is a section on specifically on that, so I can look it up for you and pass it on. But to my knowledge, you can get it, but I may not know the nuanced clinical individual patient level detail on that, but there are probably others in the audience keen to hear.
Do you know the answer to that, Ravi, or is there anyone in the Pacific audience that has a knowledge of that?
Chris, sorry, patients who are immunosuppressed, it's not contraindicated unless you've, I think you get the 6 months time if you've received convalescent plasma. That's one of it, but that's not a contraindication. The only thing is immunosuppressed patients and patients on immunosuppression might not have a significant immune response to have immunity. So, but there's no contraindication to my knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi.
Yeah. Mylene, we might take your question last and then close today's session because I'm mindful everyone might have to go to other things. Mylene, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Miru. The question is really on, you know, if you, just like how we check for immunity, checking your antibodies. So antibodies to the vaccine or antibodies after natural infection. Does it, I guess the question really is kind of following what Polo was asking earlier. You know, you've had the vaccine or you've had the infection, and especially vaccine, you've had the vaccine, so maybe you don't need to be quarantined. So instead of the vaccine, maybe checking the antibodies to see whether they really mounted an immune response to it or some immunity. Would that be a better option than just saying, oh, I've received the vaccine, but really check whether you really mounted immunity? Yeah.
Yeah, really great question, Mylene. One of the complexities of that is that we don't actually 100% know how the vaccine works as well. So we know that the bodies have a really, really important role immunologically in protecting against infection, and the antibodies attack the virus. But there is also some evidence emerging, and there's probably a role for T cells as well to protect against infection. Like several other vaccines, actually, not all, but several vaccines, not having antibody or not converting after the vaccine is seroconverting after the vaccine is not uncommon. So based on that, it's difficult to make a decision, but also pragmatically, operationally speaking, it's not always feasible. We're vaccinating millions of people. So to be able to do antibody testing on people is resource intensive, money intensive, time intensive. We don't have great antibody rapid test kits. So I think practically as well, but also immunologically, I don't think we can say with confidence that that will be the best way to protect. At the moment, I haven't seen any major studies to say that there was immune failure in people. There's obviously variability, and we've seen that with natural infection as well. Somebody vaccinated may get mild disease, and in some people we might get more severe, like more higher viral titers. There's variation, but in a population level, we're not seeing much immune failure. So I think it's a little bit more difficult to answer right now. And I think practically speaking, to test people for antibodies will be quite challenging from resources point of view and just the feasibility of that. I don't know if that answers your question, Mylene.
Thank you, Miru. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. But thank you everyone for listening. I might pass it back to Chris. And like I said, in 2 weeks, we've got Professor Julie Lees coming and talking about communications around vaccines. And if there's other things you want to hear about, please shoot me an email. You've got my details, or through Chris as well. Back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I might hand the final comment over to Ravi, if Ravi's happy to give us what the update in Fiji for our audience that's online. I'm sure we're all very interested, and then maybe close after that. Ravi, can you give us an update, Ravi?
Thank you, Chris. As you know, we have had a large cluster of cases who can be traced from a breach in the quarantine facility. One of our military personnel did not abide by the protocols, and it was transmitted to a maid, and the maid went to a funeral, which we see as a super spreader event. The funeral actually had about 400 people who are attending. So it's been a massive task for public health to contact trace this 300 or 400 people. And so far we've had two distinct clusters, one in the west. So that's Nandi and Lotoka. So people who went to the funeral, and two separate clusters in Suva, around Suva. So and just yesterday we found a patient who had traveled to Suva, was positive in Raki. If you know the geographic, that's a whole different, about two, 3 towns away from Suva. So there has been a massive containment effort to trace, in particular, the people who had attended the funeral and their primary contacts. So that's where we are at the moment. And like we said a couple of weeks ago, our risk for getting a COVID vaccine and having COVID was very different compared to now, I think. It's a moving target, so we'll see how it progresses. That's where we are in Fiji at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, and all the very best wishes and thoughts for everybody in Fiji. We know the lockdowns do work, because we've certainly done that ourselves in our little state down here in Victoria. If there's no more questions, then I'd like to thank Meru. I'd like to thank everybody for the contributions today. It's the discussion that makes these forums amazing and incredibly valuable. And we learn so much from your experiences in the Pacific Island countries, and from your knowledge, and as well as hearing from Chris and Meru. So we've got to talk again. Meru is organising 2 more sessions, one a fortnight, 2 weeks from now, and then 2 weeks after that. We'll distribute it as we've already done through email, through I do that through Viber and Messenger, and through all of your networks, and mailing through IMOPS. And yeah, we look forward and seeing you in a couple of weeks' time. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Meru.
Thank you, everyone.